Okay, so I thought we'd start by just seeing, feeling, reluctant to use the word visualizing, but feeling inside and seeing inside us a white light in our heart, in the central heart. And I thought we'd chant 3 mantric R's, each R on a single but extended breath. And so the mantra R in Tibetan Buddhism is the mantra of primordial space. It's the mantra of sound, vibration, and that which mediates between the body and the mind. So sound is the mediation. And so seeing, feeling within our central heart this white light. And then as we chant the first R, seeing, coming, feeling from our heart, rays of white light extending out into the cosmos in all directions as far as possible, and into the R, the white syllable R, in the heart of all enlightened beings. And then we breathe silently together. And then with the second R, we receive. So with the second R, we receive from the white, the luminous white syllable R in the hearts of all enlightened beings, along the rays of light from out in the cosmos, from the hearts of all enlightened beings back into the luminous white R in the center of our own hearts. That's the second R where we receive, and then we breathe silently together again. And then with the third R, we remain in the presence of the transmission of this enlightenment. Okay. So the first R, we see the luminous letter in our hearts, rays of white light going out into the universe, into the hearts of all enlightened beings, into the R in their hearts. Silent breath. And then breathing in and receiving from the luminous white R in the heart of all enlightened beings, the transmission of enlightenment along the rays of light back into the white R's, luminous white letter and white light in our own hearts. And then the third one, we remain in its presence. Okay. So let's just close our eyes for a moment and see that luminous white light in our heart. And established the presence of the enlightened beings all around us in the cosmos, ready and waiting to receive. Now we receive from them. And now we remain in the presence of this transmission. Okay. So as living beings, the most important thing for us is to remain living. And in traditional cultures, how this was done was by praising that being in whose hands our continued living was held, the divine. In other words, being friends with the boss. Good manners. And so the three ways that this relationship was sustained was by what I call the 3 Ps: praise, petition, and participation. So in that order. So first praising, honoring, being polite, and then petitioning, then asking for help, and then on a more sophisticated level, participating, becoming one with, overcoming the separation and becoming one with the divine. So I call these the 3 Ps. These are the ways that all humans had of remaining living. So when I started this, which was an embarrassingly long time ago, I realized that most traditions talked about the beginning as a sonorous one, as a sonorous process. So every tradition, from the Christian one in the beginning was the word, the Hindu one, the Neoplatonic one, the Dogon, the 7 vibrations of Ogotameli. All these different traditions talk about the creation of the world through sound, and not just the creation of the world through sound, but it's also a continuous process. So the world is translated from spirit into matter, and then we have a job to do, which is to turn matter back into spirit. So it's a continuous process. So, for example, in the Hindu tradition, one version of this is when Shiva, instead of being the destroyer, is the creator. And he's the creator when he begins to dance. I'm sure you've all seen the dancing Shiva in a circle of flames, when he has a drum or damaru in one hand and a flame in the other. And the world comes awake as he begins to dance. And as he dances, out of his damaru, out of his drum, his double-sided drum, fall all the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. In other words, just like in the Bible, in the beginning was the word, beginning creation through language itself. And so where these letters fall is interesting. Where they fall is into and become the sonorous petals around the chakras along the spine of each one of us. So that our return journey is a mantric one, is returning yogically back up through the chakras, transforming these originally creative letters and transforming the physical being back and on into spirit again. So it's a continuous process, the descent and the translation of spirit into matter and matter back into spirit. And all this is all done through sound. So my first realization, my first transmission of the power of sound, and in particular the voice, came when I was a very young child. And I had a very eccentric father. We used to spend our summers in Ireland, and he would set us out on journeys when everybody else was going to bed. And on one particular occasion, we were going over to this remote island off the west coast of Ireland at night when everybody else was going to bed. And the only other people in the boat were 3 old women standing in the back of the boat, dressed in black, and my brother and I and my mother and father. And as we set off, a storm blew up. The wind became ferocious and the waves violent, and we knew we were going to drown, and we were absolutely terrified. And then all of a sudden, these 3 women in the back of the boat started a wild cry chant. And in that moment, our terror became ecstasy. Our fear became bliss. And the wind abated and the storm stopped. So what I witnessed as a young child was this ability of sound to manifest itself as transformation, to transform, firstly, our emotions from one extreme to the other, terror into bliss, and to transform the very elements themselves. So I realized very early on that the voice was really the key to everything. And so much later, I began to realize that something very peculiar had happened in our society, and that the more sophisticated our society became, the more silent we became. The more sophisticated the culture, the less we chanted or sang together. All the institutions, all the liturgies that had held societies together over the generations were being eroded by an increase in atheism and dissatisfaction with the current societal religious forms. And so gradually all the reasons that we had for chanting were eroded. And the old people forgot their songs. No longer babies were rocked to sleep with lullabies. We had gone silent. People, increasingly all of us, sitting in front of screens, never more connected to everybody that we know with a little press of a button, but silently, so that maybe I thought we might remember there was a time when our mouths opened, sound came out of them. Do you remember when our mouths opened, sound came out? So I realized that this was a real pathology of the state of the world, this silence. So traditionally people chanted to stay alive. So how are people staying alive now? Since the 17th century, people started trying to predict what would happen to tomorrow based on what had happened yesterday. So counting. So we began to count and measure what had happened yesterday and then assume that the same thing would happen tomorrow, and in this way feel that as long as we were wearing a white coat, we would know what would happen tomorrow and all would be well. But in this way, our sense of the divine was eroded, was no longer relevant, and with it, all the ways that we'd had of invoking the divine, embedding our presence in the resonance of the divine communication, all had disappeared from our lives. And so I decided that I felt that if we were disenchanted, which is what it seemed to me, the more disenchanted we became, I began to think about what that meant. And I began to take it literally. You know, to be disenchanted is to be no longer made magical through chant. And therefore the remedy for this is to chant. So I started to get small groups of people together in order to remedy this, in order to chant. But my first question really was, you know, if we're going to sing again, if we're going to chant again, what song are we going to sing? And that isn't obvious, because as long as you're using words, you could be singing the right song or the wrong song. So if you're singing a national anthem one side of the border, you're singing the right song. But if you step over the border, it's the wrong song. So I really was looking to find a way of chanting which was which embodied all the means by which it had been used in all traditions, but without people having to be a card-carrying Sufi or Buddhist or Christian, but to really extract the essence of all these traditional methods. And so we're resonant beings. Everything has its identity by the regularity and the periodicities of its movements. And if we stop making sounds, then our bodies go to sleep. We stop resonating, we stop activating them. And at the very core of every tradition, every spiritual tradition, the central core of every spiritual tradition is how do we become and remain present. So what happens normally is that we're taught from an early age to name things. You know, we sit on our parents' lap and they say dog and cat and sheep, and we gradually accumulate. And the more names we have for things, the better universities we can go to and the better marks we get. But the more separate we are from that which is not us, because the more differentiated that which is not us has become, and the more the boundaries of separation and the ego are strengthened. So I had two, well, first of all, my second realization about sound came when I saw the work, well, no, perhaps I should say it was bred on the bone. My mother was a concert pianist, and my father was a surgeon. So sort of healing and sound were bred on the bone. But then I saw the work of Hans Jenny, and Hans Jenny was a student of Rudolf Steiner who took all kinds of seamless substances, liquids and pastes and fine powders like lycopodium powder and kaolin paste, and he subjected them to vibrations. He put them on resonating films and then put through them different kinds of sounds and vibrations. And what you saw was these films, these seamless, formless substances gradually take on all the patterns of the natural world, the patterns on the back of zebras and shells and butterflies, suddenly just manifested through sound. So I realized that this really was the key. And so if we were going to reinduct resonance and sound back into our communities, how would that be? So I had done two things. I had, in 1971 to 74, I'd been living in Germany with a German composer called Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. And he had composed a piece called Stimmung for 6 singers, which was on a single note, but by changing the shape of the resonant cavity was amplifying the inner notes or the harmonics of the sound. And this was also a traditional form of Tibetan chanting. So very early on in the end of the 60s and early 70s, I started studying Tibetan Buddhism with these lamas, and particularly with the chant master of the Gyuto monks, who did this form of chanting on a single note, where you amplify the inner sounds within the note itself. So this was quite useful because so many people have been told to stand at the back and mouth it because they apparently couldn't match a pitch or sing in tune, or had been told to be quiet. And it's not possible to be out of tune on a single note. So this seemed a very useful way of beginning. So I started teaching this form of chant, overtone chanting as it's called, or harmonic chant, humi as it's called, amongst the Tuvans who also do it. This form of chanting is found in Central Asia only, traditionally. It's found amongst the Tuvans, the Mongolians, and the Tibetans, who all do different forms of it. And so this is what I started to do, and I might just try and demonstrate this. So these notes are called harmonics, and the really interesting thing about these notes is that they're in tune. Now that might sound kind of weird, but one of the things that happened in our frenzy of counting in the 17th century was there arose a problem in music called the problem of tuning. And so, and this came with the popularity of keyboard instruments. So before that, the tuning had gone from one note to a note 5 notes above it. The fifth, as it's called. And this is the most consonant interval after the octave, which is somehow identity. So this was how tuning happened, from a note to its fifth and so on. But the problem with keyboard instruments was that they became very out of tune in one part and very in tune in others. And so the tuning, if you go from a note to its fifth and from that note to its fifth, 5 notes above, 5 notes above, 5 notes above. So in theory, you should eventually come to the octave above where you started, but actually you don't. You overlap it by a quarter of a semitone, known as the Pythagorean comma. And this is the problem. This quarter of a semitone causes no end of grief in music. And so, in the 17th century, what happened was that all the kind of polymaths and mathematicians and musicians got together and thought, what can we do about this Pythagorean comma, this quarter of a semitone? What can we do with it? So all kinds of methods were proposed. And eventually, what happened was what's known as the tempered scale, the well-tempered scale, which I'm sure you've heard about. And so what happened was this quarter of a semitone was rammed back into the octave, and all the intervals in the octave were made a little bit out of tune. But so little out of tune that they thought that it was thought that nobody would actually notice or mind. And in fact, that's more or less what happened. So all our music in the West is out of tune, and most people don't notice, and most people don't mind. But if you think being sound and mind and body means being in tune, then maybe we should rethink whether we mind or notice. Because actually what's happening is we're being retuned out of tune every time we entrain. When we're resonant beings and we entrain, we get into tune with anything that's around us. So if we listen to music that's out of tune, we become out of tune, which means highly strung, cracked, not sound in mind and body, and so on. And so if somebody comes to your house to tune your piano, you might rightly, wrongly actually, think that you're paying them good money to tune your piano in tune. In fact, you're paying them good money to tune your piano out of tune. And I was brought up in a house with 3 concert grands, so I had, in fact, almost more pianos than people. So anyway, our current piano tuner, because all my family plays the piano, is called Bruce. And I have this joke with Bruce. I say, Bruce, when he's tuning the piano and drinking his tea, and I say, Bruce, are the octaves in tune? And there's a sort of deadly pause, and he says, stretched. Bruce, are the octaves in tune? Stretched, he says. So now we have this little joke. He says, well, I tell people I'm going to stretch their octaves. So music is out of tune, and most people don't notice and most people don't mind. But the thing about the harmonics, these intervals that you heard, is that they can only be and are in tune. So by amplifying these sounds so that they become audible and doing it as a practice means that we can actually become resonantly in tune, which is and there really aren't many ways that we can do that. So this was the way that I introduced, and all these many years ago, and started giving workshops, teaching people how to do this. And at that time, really nobody had heard of it. Nobody had heard of Tuvans and Mongolians and overtone chanting and Humi and all this kind of thing. It was very little understood and almost not known at all. And so this became the way that I began to introduce sound. So first of all, before we actually start to make sound together, which is part of the plan this evening, I wanted to say a little bit more about the importance of it. So firstly, as I mentioned earlier, we're resonant beings, and therefore it's really important to be in tune. And to resonate means to re-sound. And so when you heard those sounds, I don't know, sometimes people feel that there's a certain familiarity. It's almost like a recognition. I don't know if anybody, did any of you feel a recognition? So the word recognize is a very interesting one. It means to recognize. It means you're recognizing something that you before cognized, that you before knew. So you're knowing again something that you already knew. And the way that we already know these is because they are we're making audible our own resonant geometry. So we're hearing ourselves. So two other things that are really important about using sound together. One of the things about sound is that every sound, every form has its own sound. And I'm sure you've all tried winding a wet finger around a wine glass till it sings. And if you have a really true voice and you have a very expensive wine glass, you can then direct the sound of the glass back to itself and shatter it. Because the sound of a thing is the key to its own dissolution. So every form has its own sound, and it's the sound of a thing which separates it from that which it isn't. And so in traditional cultures, people chanted together to create community because it dissolved boundaries. So sound dissolves boundaries between spirit and matter, and it dissolves boundaries between us and nature and between each other, and allows us to overcome separation. And this is the key in every spiritual tradition, is how do we overcome separation? Because I see you and I like you and I want you, but I can never have enough of you, so I'm attached to you. So I'm in a state of attachment. Or I see you and I don't like you, but I'm lumbered with you, and then I'm angry and I push you away. So, and both these are based on the delusion of separation. And delusion because we really know better. We really know there's no separation, but we act as if there is, which is ignorance, which is ignoring the fact that there is no separation, but acting as if there is. So this separation is the cause of all our woes. And so how do we overcome this separation? How do we get to the core of practice, which is being present? So we name all these things, we know all these names, and then it's separate, more and more is separate from us. And how do we overcome that separation that we have learnt so effectively to create and exacerbate by more and more names? So the thing about chanting is that you can only chant in the present. You can't chant in the past, and you can't chant in the future. And so what happens to us is that we see an object. So I see this glass of water, and I label it water, hopefully, thinking that if it's water, I can drink it. Or I see these candles, these battery candles, and they remind me that when I'm chanting, I always like to have a candle in the middle, and I get these I get these red memorial candles. I'm sure you've seen them. They're sadly in plastic, so I think I better stop. But anyway, they're in plastic. And they're red. And they're Catholic, so they don't exist much in England. So I buy them when I go to South Germany or to Italy or Spain. They're all made in China now. And I bring them, I go to supermarkets and I buy vast quantities of these red candles. And everybody else has cabbages and bananas, and I have red candles. And I go to customs, and they think I've got a lot of dead relatives, which I do, and comes with all my candles. Anyway, so candles. And then I look at these candles, and then I'm reminded that actually I've run out, and I need to go to Germany and get some more. And in fact, they've started melting in my cupboard. And so every time I see a candle, battery or otherwise, I'm reminded of the fact that actually I have run out of candles, and therefore I have to go and get some. So so this perceptual moment of candleizing has triggered off regrets of the past and dreads of the future. and exiled me from the present. So I'm in a state of anxiety based on what I didn't do yesterday and have therefore to do tomorrow. And we live our lives in this burdensome state of regrets of the past and dreads of the future. So being in the present is the only reality there is. And so how do we break through this cycle of exile from the present and go home, come home, come home. So as I said, you can only chant in the present. And, but you can chant in the present and still worry about when you get your next candles. However, if you chant in the present and instead of worrying about your German supermarket, you actually listen to the sound that you're making while you're making it, then you are creating a circuit of attention, and if you maintain that listening, you have no space left to go German supermarket shopping. So the key when you're chanting is that it's more important to listen to the sound that you're making than to make the sound that you're listening to. So I thought we could try. Shall we try?
Yes.
So we're a wind instrument, which means we're a tube with holes in us through which we blow, and so that's quite important to become aware of it. And so there's just one thing before we start, that the mind is very, very clever and is always kind of one step ahead of our attempts to interfere with it. And so one of the keys to becoming present is to splinter the attention into as many bits as you possibly can and focus on them at the same time until the discursive mind just gives up. So, for example, the Tibetans are very good at this. They have you sit in a particular way by being aware that you're sitting in that way while you're sitting. And then you're breathing at the same time as sitting and being aware of sitting. You're breathing in a particular way while being aware that you're breathing in that particular way while sitting and being aware of sitting. And at the same time, you're visualizing a complex mandala, which is a circle with the squares with 4 directions with sort of triangular bits in the middle. And then there's a deity in the middle. And then there are various things that might have 1,000 arms, and there might be 1,000 objects in the 1,000 arms with different colors depending on the directions that they belong to and the afflictive emotions that they are. And you're sitting, being aware of sitting, and you're breathing and being aware of breathing, and you're visualizing the circle and the squares and the doors and the entrance and the letter and the deity in the middle. But actually you have to identify with the deity, which means you have to actually switch around because it's like wearing a t-shirt, so you're seeing the deity as you. And then on the center of the deity is a letter, and the letter is a sonorous one, so you have to chant the letter, and while chanting the letter, listen to yourself chanting while sitting, being aware of sitting, breathing, being aware of breathing, visualizing until the mind freaks out. So that's the plot. Okay. Right, so now we're going to splinter the attention. So let's start off by putting our hands on our knees. And putting our attention in the contact that our hands have with our knees. And feeling the warmth of the contact. And allow that warmth of that contact to expand and expand so that it actually includes us, contains us in its warmth and expanse. And so keeping that going, I'd like us to maintain that awareness of the contact between our hands and our knees and the warmth of that contact, and I'm going to add various other attentions which I'd like us to hold simultaneously. So while maintaining that, the contact and the warmth of the contact between your hands and your knees, begin now to breathe through your ears to contain the soundness around you without identifying any particular part of it. To integrate with the soundness around you, containing it in the, enveloping it in the hearing attention. Maintaining the warmth of the contact, breathing through the ears, maintaining those two simultaneously, and we'll add a third one, which is now just becoming aware of the breath as it rises and falls, maintaining the listening awareness and the warmth of the contact, and become aware of the breathing. And maintain presence with the breath as it comes and goes, with a silky quality, as it has a silky presence. In the throat. So that's 3 simultaneous awarenesses. So now with that out-breath and in-breath, I'd like us to focus on the out-breath. Let the in-breath take care of itself, and we're still listening to the soundness around without identifying any part of it. We're still present with the warmth of the contact between our hands and our knees. And now I'd like us to extend the out-breath and allow the in-breath to take care of itself. So when you get to the place where you would normally breathe in, continue to breathe out further by a gentle pressure on the abdominal muscles. And then releasing them to allow the air to fill you up again. So maintaining all these awareness at the same time, I'd like us now to gradually translate our breath into sound, but through the ears, so that we maintain presence with the emerging sound, so it's contained within the vessel of our hearing continuously. And when we remember that we've forgotten, tricky because we have forgotten, but when we remember that we've forgotten to listen, remember again to remember to listen and come back, so that there is no separation between the sound that we're making and the hearing that we are integrating with the sound that we're making. So we'll tune together for some time in this way, and then eventually, very gradually, allow the sound to become quieter again. And as the sound becomes quieter, we're increasing the listening to the sound becoming quieter until we finally find ourselves listening to the absence of sound. And when we find ourselves listening to the absence of sound, we introduce presence into the listening to the absence of sound, and in that we remain. So let's tune together in that way together. Okay, so how do you feel when we stop chanting? Present. What? Present. Good. Good. Huh? Sleepy. Yes. Peace. Relax. Wait. Shame to stop. Yes.
Felt like my whole body was kind of humming.
Yes, it was. Yes, whole body humming. Yes. How was it? Was it easy to remember to maintain the listening?
No.
Yeah, it's very easy to forget, isn't it? And then once you've forgotten, it's very hard to remember that you've forgotten, because you've forgotten. Yeah, so that's the core. Could you hear the harmonics?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, how do you do it? Okay. By changing the shape of the resonant cavity. So, it's a little bit like, the best analogy is with light. So we know that white light contains the rainbow colors, but we don't see them unless it's raining and sunny at the same time, or unless it's shining through a prism in your window. So it's only when the light is refracted through something that it reveals its colors. And it's the same with sound. In fact, these are called color. They're called the timbre, or in German it's the Klangfarbe, the tone color. So it's almost like the homeopathy of sound. It's that part of the sound that's most powerful but most pure in a way. And it's called, we have to borrow from the language of light and sound in music to describe this particular parameter. So with light it goes through a prism and then it reveals its rainbow colors. But with sound it goes through a filter. And so the filter is the shape of the resonant cavity. And so the way that we use this all the time is when we speak. So language has anybody who works with language, there's a very fundamental division between what's called vowels and consonants. And so vowels are what happens. So when you make a sound, so air comes up and goes over this big muscle in the larynx called the vocal folds. It's not sometimes called chords, but actually it's a big muscle that meets, so there aren't any chords. And then, depending on the tension of that muscle, determines the pitch that you make. And then what happens after that in all the cavities of the head and the larynx and the pharynx determines what's called the timbre, or the color, or the quality, or the Klangfarbe, or the harmonics of the sound. So the difference between one vowel and another, so if I say oo, o, a, hi, a, oo, those are all different vowels on the same note, but you're able to identify them, I think. Yes? So what you're actually hearing, or what we hear but don't realize, is you're hearing different harmonics amplified. So this is a big question you asked. Are you sure you're ready for the answer? So, okay, so let's say this is a resonating string, a monochord, with apologies to Pythagoras, it's a rubber band. Okay, so if I vibrate this rubber band, so the note, the fundamental note, for example, when I was making it, is what happens when the overall string is vibrating. But if you look carefully, what's happening to the string? More in the middle, yeah? Can we be a bit more precise? If you had to draw this on a board, what would you see?
Spinning.
Yeah? Spinning?
It's a combination of the other harmonics.
Yeah. So what it's doing is it's dividing itself up. So, so the overall string is the note. It divides in half. What happens if you divide a string in half? Does anybody remember?
You got the answer.
Yeah. So we have the octave, which is the first harmonic. Then it divides itself into 3, which gives the fifth. So now we have the note, we have the octave, and then we have the fifth above the octave, which is, so this is dividing into 2, dividing into 3, and then dividing into 4 is the next octave. So whenever you allow a string to vibrate, or anything, or a column of air to vibrate, it divides itself up. You don't do it, it does it itself. And every time, each division is another harmonic. So you hear all these at the same time. So you hear the fundamental note, you hear the octave, the fifth, the fourth, the major third, minor. So when you hear sound, you never hear just a pure tone, unless you hear a sine wave generator or a tuning fork comes close. But normally when we hear a sound, we hear all these other sounds at the same time. And which ones we hear is determined by, if you're talking about musical instruments, each musical instrument will amplify some as opposed to others, giving it a particular quality that that instrument has. Or each one of us has a completely unique voice and timbre and harmonic structure to our voice. There are no two, just like there are no two fingerprints alike, there are no two voices identical, because each one of us has an entirely different spectrum of harmonics determined by our shapes. And so they're quite unique. So whenever we hear a sound, we think we're hearing one note, but we're not. We're hearing a multiplicity of sounds. So what I was doing was I was selectively amplifying these different sounds by changing the shape of the resonant cavity, because these sounds come about through resonance, which means literally to re-sound. So this form of chanting depends on sustaining the sound and containing the sound, because if you contain a sound, it hangs around long enough to re-sound. So if you just have a wide open mouth, it just dissipates and nothing happens. But if you contain it, so resonance happens in containing shapes. That's why caves, for example, are very resonant, because they're, in fact, the most resonant. What is the most resonant space? A sphere. So a sphere is the most resonant space because there's nowhere on the surface of the sphere that doesn't face the center. So this is the most resonant. So to do this, you really make a kind of and then the other quality of resonance is hard surfaces, like bathroom. That's why everybody likes singing in the bath. Round bathrooms would be even better. So then by sequentially changing the shape of the resonant cavities, you're able to amplify selectively the harmonics. So we might do a little bit of that. There's quite how much? We've got plenty of time. Good. Because before we did that, I wanted to talk a bit about other aspects of sound and then come back to that. And then I also wanted to talk about another aspect of my work relating to transgenerational patterns. But another thing I wanted to talk about was everyone's leaving. Pee break. Yeah. Okay. Mantra. Anybody who's been interested in the spiritual aspects of the voice has heard about mantra. So mantra is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's a way of tricking the mind into thinking it's in the discursive mode, because mantra seems to be words or language, except that it's usually in an archaic language. So, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, most liturgies are in archaic languages. Church Slavonic, for example, and then very often it's repeated. So the same phrase or the same word is repeated and repeated and repeated. So lulling the mind into thinking it's in the familiar territory of the discursivity, only to find that it's repeated and repeated. And actually when you examine the words, firstly they're in archaic languages, and secondly they often don't mean anything. They're often in nonsense language. Some of them mean something individually, so each word might mean something, but it doesn't usually make a sentence, for example, even though it seems to be a sentence. And the function of mantra is to use language to go beyond language, to go into the nature of mind itself, beyond language, and particularly beyond thought, which language evokes. The two are sort of indistinguishable. So mantra is used, it's a way of harnessing the spirit and incorporating it into matter. And either to tune into a stream of transmission through a lineage of teachers, for example, so that you're able to become enlightened by using the means that all your lineage of teachers have used to become enlightened, and then added the power of enlightenment back into the power of attainment available through chanting the mantra. Or it's used for healing, but mainly to go beyond discursive thought into the nature of mind itself. So I thought we might chant a mantra. Would you like to try a mantra? So there are many, many mantras. So I thought maybe we would. So I spent a long time, over 40 years, studying Tibetan Buddhism, and I find it's a very extraordinary tradition. And so they have a practice which is called Deity Practice, where you see an aspect of divinity in the form of a being. And in simple practices, you might sort of ask favors or ask for help. In more sophisticated practices, you become that being and so manifest the qualities that they have, that quality of enlightenment. And so mantra can be used for either for invoking the presence of this aspect of divinity in order to avail yourself of the characteristics, or actually to integrate with this aspect of divinity yourself. So I thought we would maybe chant the mantra of Tara. Tara is the feminine aspect of many forms of enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism, very similar to Kuan Yin in China or Japan, and Canon, Kuan Yin, Kwanse, Kwanseum, Kwanse. She has different forms. So Tara is known as hearing the cries of pain in the world and coming to help. So she answers our prayers, and at the same time, she's part of. There's a very famous story about the Buddha. He decided to find out how all the bodhisattvas had become enlightened. So a bodhisattva is usually a human being who, through practice and grace, becomes enlightened, but decides, instead of making a vertical takeoff, decides to stay around and help everybody else become enlightened. So the Buddha gathered a circle of the bodhisattvas around him and asked each one in turn, how did you become enlightened? What practice did you do? And what happened when you did that? And then what did you do? And what happened when you did that? And this is described in one of the sutras. And so he listened to all the stories of all these enlightened beings, how they became enlightened. And then finally he listened to Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, who said that she, because he's a bit of both, became enlightened, very fashionable, became enlightened through entering into the stream of sound, through overcoming the separation between sound and hearing the sound. And so this is, and so Tara is a sort of manifestation of the bodhisattva of compassion and has that quality. So her qualities of enlightenment have also to do with sound. So very appropriate. Okay, so her mantra is an interesting one because actually it's an example of a mantra where the words really don't mean anything at all. So it starts with Om, as lots of mantras do. Om is interesting because it's really all the vowels except E, ow, and then a nasalization, which is the integration into the material world, because the vowels are traditionally thought of as being divine in their nature, and in fact in many sacred languages they're not articulated because, or written down, because that would be to limit that which is limitless, whereas the vowels are the incorporation of sound within the material world, the consonants. Om, so her mantra is Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Svaha. So it's Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Svaha. And so it begins with Om and ends with Svaha. And Svaha is sometimes pronounced Soha or Soham, and it's a little bit sort of like so be it. It sort of authenticates what's gone before it. So let's just say the mantra together. So Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture, Svaha. So really, none of those words actually mean anything. It's not even her name. It's Om Tare. It's not Tara. So it's an example, but it's an interesting collection of T sounds. And these aspects of divinities, have what are called seed syllables. And when you allow them to manifest, they often manifest out of this syllable. And interestingly, Tara's seed syllable is tam. So there's this T quality, which is mysterious, but there. So it's Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture Svaha. And there are many, many versions, many melodies, and this is quite a simple one. But the main thing about when chanting the mantra is to listen. So that there's integration between the sound that you're making and the vessel of hearing that's containing it. So when you remember you've forgotten, come back and listen. So there's no separation between the sound and the listening. Okay. So it's very simple, just two bits. Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture Soha. Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture Soha. That's it. Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture Soha. 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 Om embrace the absence of sound with listening attention. Okay, mantra. Okay, so I'd like now to just sort of shift focus a little bit and then come back to the sound and the overtones. But I also wanted to talk about this transgenerational traumas and how we find ourselves doing things which seem to make no sense with what we were doing before. I don't know if any of you have ever suddenly found that. Wait a minute, whoa, what am I doing? We have a way of fulfilling the unfulfilled ambitions of our parents, often, without realizing why. So this work is really, really interesting, and so whenever in previous generations in our family there's been some kind of an interruption, somebody's died young, maybe committed suicide, had an accident, separated, emigrated, had an abortion, been given up for adoption, given up somebody for adoption, lost a twin at birth, lost a mother at birth, all the kind of things that happen in all of our families all of the time over the generations. It's some kind of a curtailment or interruption in what might be perceived as a normal flowering of a life, for example. And when there's this interruption, there's something about the trauma which becomes a stable pattern in the field of the family and ancestors and continues on down through the generations and attracts members of each generation to follow in some way what happened in the early generation without the person knowing necessarily that this person existed or what happened to them. But they find themselves, and quite often they find themselves being excluded or left out or self-exiled or addicted or separated or forgotten or disliked or disowned or abandoned. So in some way following the exclusion of the earlier member of the family without often having any idea about what happened or who it happened to. So this work is, well, actually it's very interesting because the kind of buzzword in science right now is epigenetics. And so in the 70s, ooh, a long time ago, I did a research fellowship in the biophysics department of King's College with Maurice Wilkins, who, with Watson and Crick, got the Nobel Prize for DNA. Remember DNA? And at that time, it was all the rage, and everything was thought to be in the DNA. And if you mentioned Lamarck or Lysenko or any of these people who believed in, like Darwin, in the inheritance of acquired characters, they would pale and sort of go like this. And but now it's the latest buzzword in science. So there are people studying the transgenerational effect of the Irish famine, of the famine in Holland after the war, the Holocaust. All these things are found to induct chemical changes into the descendants. And in fact, one of the most interesting experiments was done with the inheritance of fear in mice. This was done about 4 years ago in America, where mice were subjected to an electric shock while at the same time smelling a totally innocuous scent of something called acetone phenone, something they didn't know, which has a scent a bit like flowers or something like that, something quite innocuous. So that they were subjected to this combination of quite a pleasant smell with a pain. And then they were bred in vitro. So they were bred in a way that the parent and the children and the grandchildren mice should have no contact with each other. And it was found that not only the children mice, but the grandchildren mice were terrified of the smell. So they had inherited transgenerationally the association of fear with this particular smell. So this is a classic experiment for epigenetics. So this work with transgeneration trauma is now finally being recognized scientifically. And so the work is very interesting because how it works is I do this work in groups, and somebody who's working will choose naive representatives or people from the group to represent their parents and their siblings, for example, and then would place them in the room to represent as a kind of tableau the dynamics of the relationships between them as perceived by them, and then place themselves. And then, in this completely astonishing and mysterious way, when a person is chosen to represent a parent or a sibling or whoever it is, they mysteriously seem to tune into that person, feel like that person, speak like that person, respond like that person, react like that person. It's quite baffling. And the most extreme, my son Cosmo, that some of you I think know, musician, when he did this for the first time, I had somebody who I'd been working with for a long time who was there with his brother, and his brother was the vulnerable one, and so this person chose my son Cosmo to represent his brother, who was sitting over there. And Cosmo had never done this before, and he's very rational, although he's a musician. And so he stood there for a moment, and suddenly he kind of crumpled. He's quite cheery chap. And suddenly he crumpled, and which I kind of recognize as, representing the person he was representing, but he reacted very strongly and said, no, I'm Cosmo, and came back and said, this isn't happening. And then again, I watched him very carefully, knowing him all these years, and then he sort of crumpled again. No, I'm Cosmo, this isn't happening. And then crumbled again. And finally he got it and relaxed, and and so it's as palpable as that. Somehow we mysteriously become this person. And so the work is then the unfolding of this pattern of the dynamics that the person has laid out, which then reveals what these traumas are, where they've come from, and the work is about restoring the outliers. So those who've been disowned and disliked are brought back and honored. So for example, if there's an abuser in the family, if you reject somebody in your family, then you punish yourself and feel guilty. You feel guilty and then punish yourself. So you're the sufferer. So the work is about a sort of honoring those who've been dismissed and disliked and rejected and so forth, and recognizing all those who have had this kind of interruption. So grandparents are brought in and great-grandparents, and whoever is relevant is brought into this moving tableau in such a way that all these issues which were left hanging in time are resolved. And the effects are amazing. Extraordinary things start coming in left field. Somebody rang me today, come on another, because people do many of them, to say that her daughter had been trying to have a child for 3 years after she'd done this work around her daughter, got pregnant. And things like that happened the whole time. So extraordinary things start manifesting immediately. It's very, very amazing. And I can't encourage you enough to do the work. Yeah?
Does it have to be someone who doesn't know the family member to then step into that role?
Usually it is. Yeah, usually. I mean, so I'll work with a group of people, and although because many of them have done it many times, they know each other. Yeah. They don't usually know somebody's grandmother.
Do it within the family as a way of experiencing what it's like to be that person.
So if I work with multiple people in the same family, so for example, if I have 2 sisters coming, or a mother and a daughter, or a father and a son, then when I work with them, I have other people to represent their family members. So say I have you, and say you had a sister and you both came to do the work. When you were working, I wouldn't have somebody else represent your sister, not her. So she would watch the family. And that's the other thing, is that when you see the family through the eyes of different members, siblings for example, you wouldn't recognize it. Because of where we come in the birth order, what's happening in the family, we have a totally different understanding of the family. And that's mind-blowing. I mean, that's really helpful. Yeah. So it's really, really, really useful. Yeah. Okay. So.
Sorry.
No. So any, and so anyway, this is completely. So this is better than any kind of talking therapy that I've ever come across. This is immediate in its effect and quite astonishing. And
tap into traumas that happened if you didn't know they'd happened.
Well,
there's some dynamic.
Yeah.
You don't know where it is.
Yeah.
You know,
Usually.
How can you go back in time? Can those things be addressed? They come through in those sessions.
Yeah, they do.
How do you recognise them as being?
Well, that's that's very interesting. I mean, I had somebody once who was setting up her family, and the way she set it up, I had a sense that her uncle was completely devastated by the death of his siblings, and either the pain of survival, or responsible. So I said this, and she said, "Oh, no, they're all there." So I said, "I don't think they are." So she wrote to an 80-year-old aunt who wrote back 6 months later and said, "Yes, there were 2 others. They died of diphtheria, meningitis, age 2 and 7. And the other amazing thing is that sometimes people will come back on the second day and say, "You're not going to believe this, but I'm staying with," the one person said, "I'm staying with my mother, and she was estranged from her brothers and sisters, all 6 of them, for 25 years. They all telephoned yesterday while we were working." And somebody else, somebody who's worked with me a lot, came with his sister and husband and the husband's mother, and they came back the second day. And his work, the brother-in-law, was very much about his sister, who was the kind of vulnerable one in the family. And they came back the next day and said that, "You're not going to believe this." That's what they always say, "You're not going to believe it." They'd spoken to the sister, and she'd been having dinner with a friend. And at the exact same time we were working, the friend was looking at her and saying, "What's happening? You're changing. You're looking really cheerful." And so as the work was happening, this person was changing. It's weird. Yeah.
Is your sense of it that it's coming through somehow through the physical body of the people in the room, and the way, I suppose, the sort of coding, whether that's DNA or epigenetics, or does it feel like it's a kind of shamanic calling in of spirit, the souls that are actually interested in this work and wanting to come to to heal somehow?
Yeah, I have really no idea. I mean, we're tuning into the resonant field of the family in some kind of knowing field, the ancestral field in some mysterious way that we can do. And how we, whether we call it shamanic or this or that, the other, it's all language. I mean, we don't know how it works, really. You can call it what you like, but it works, we just don't know. I mean, which words you use for it don't change it, really, or help, really. Different cultures have different ways of seeing these kind of things, giving different names to them. But basically, we don't know what it is. Just like we don't know what hypnosis is, we don't know what meditation is, we know very little, actually.
Sort of different methods of invoking it.
Yes. So it's in some mysterious way. It's a bit like you're it in the playground. When you've been. It's really interesting. I do a ceremony around birth order. When I do a week of this work, I also do a whole thing about birth order, which is very, very interesting. And I sort of allocate different corners, firstborn corner, secondborn corner, and third, fourth, and third and beyond, and so on. So people go and stand in the corners of their birth order, and then the whole thing kind of starts unfolding. And then eventually I have people move around. And so at one point there might be nobody in the firstborn corner except thirdborns, seeing what it's like. And that corner remains for those thirdborn like what it is to be a firstborn. So you can allocate the field in some very extraordinary way. It's very, very mysterious.
Can I ask, is it any problem in your knowledge can be solved by, or can be, sorry for my English, I hope that you understand. Is it any problem root in your knowledge by family? Or is it any problem can be healed by heal your family roots or connection? It's like any problem, like, I don't know, cancer, my problem, which is like fear of the water, or someone problem, I don't know, like not exactly like that you are sure when you're coming for the session with you, that you are sure that it's probably coming from your childhood or your mother childhood or something. Do you think that any problem has roots with your family and can be solved? How did you get that?
Yeah. Well, our family is a kind of field of resonance. Our handwriting looks the same as our parents. There's this sort of resonance that goes on down through the family. And most of our problems are totally unconscious, which is why talking therapy is useless. Because, unless you can get into the level of the unconscious, you can't change anything. And because of this sort of way that we sort of, mothers resonate with their daughters, we resonate down through the generations, a lot of those very deep problems are there in the family field. Definitely, yes. So most things that people come with, I find that get resolved in this way. But you can use this it's an oracular method, and you can use it for anything. It doesn't have to be the family. It can be, you can use the same method to examine anything. But I do find that most things have their roots in this family and ancestral field.
Does it have to be family members, collaborators, or you can actually be healing a relationship or something?
Yeah, I mean, you can do this work with any kind of relationship. I prefer doing it with family members because it's so fascinating.
Blood-related ones?
Yeah, blood-related ones, yeah.
It has to be blood.
Yes, but also if somebody's lived with a family for long periods, then that's also important. So it's the same, if you're adopted, then in the case of adoption, I work with the adoptive family and the birth family both, and usually have them acknowledge each other. Yeah.
Does it take a while for them to take on the character?
No, it's instantaneous.
What triggers it?
Just being told who you are. It's very extraordinary. And then when it ends, it's instantaneous as well. It's very amazing.
Is this something you've kind of discovered yourself?
Well, there's a German and sort of 95-year-old, I can't remember how old he is now, therapist called Bert Hellinger who has started a whole sort of trend of something rather similar. But I came to it quite independently. When I was teaching in Germany in the 80s, the person organizing my workshop asked me if I knew of this man, because my work was so similar. And so I came to it myself through working with sound, working with groups. I've worked with groups all my life. I started to do ceremonies for the ancestors, to acknowledge the ancestors, to honor the ancestors, going back. And I found that that was so remarkable, the effect that it had on people's lives. Just going back, honoring all the way back, acknowledging, seeing, honoring, thanking. It had such a profound effect that that's what I started with, and then I began to, articulate it much. Then I did a kind of individual ancestral detective work with people, seeing the connections with people, what they did, what their passion was, what they were fanatical about, how it related, what their names were. And anniversary syndrome, that's another one. Things happen on the same day in the families going back generations, weird things. There are all kinds of extraordinary resonances which I began to notice. So then I sort of developed it in this way.
Is it a group work?
Yes, because you need people to represent. Yeah.
So it can't be
one-on-one. Well, yes, I mean, you can do it one-on-one. I sometimes do it with little bits of paper and have people move bits of paper around with names on them, or with little dolls and things. You can do it one-on-one, but it's much more powerful in a group. Much more, yeah. Yeah, and more fun, really, more interesting. Yeah. Yeah?
I just have a question. I'm a little bit familiar with Bert Hellinger and
Yeah.
his work, but how does work come in? How does sound come in?
Yeah. So that's the other thing, that I mean, Bert and his followers do it in a rather sort of workman-like way, and sometimes he'll say things like, "Oh, well, we can't poke our noses into that," and we stop, and which I never do. Everything always resolves. So in what I use sound and kind of ceremony between each person. So I use sound to amplify the resonant field of the family and the ancestors. And I do something called the ghost dance, which was a movement started in 1870 in North America, when the white men were slaughtering the First Nation and Native Americans. And it was a movement which spread like wildfire all over North America to make contact with the ancestors, to fight the white man's bullets. It was not a very fair competition, but anyway, it was a big movement. And so it's a sort of trance dance movement to make contact with the ancestors. So between each person, so I do each one as in a very kind of ceremonial way, with chant and this movement. And because I think it's really important to embed our work in something much bigger than ourselves. That's just the way I like to work. Because we can only sort of know a bit. I mean, it's much, we need all the help we can get. Yeah. Yeah. I hope you'll all come and do it.
How this relates to past lives, and whether you may choose a family for a certain reason, with their hang-ups to experience your soul mission or whatever, so maybe sorting that out is not part of what you chose. Does it make sense?
Yeah. I mean, past lives is a whole other sort of thing, really. There's one thing I mean, I don't work with past lives because we can never really know about past lives, but I'm not. But there is some very interesting work done on past lives. So Professor Ian Stevenson from Virginia University did some really interesting work, and he has various people who are now carrying on his work. He's dead, but so what he did was he sent he had people in India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Burma, and various places, listening out for children, because it only happens up to about the age of 5, who said, well, actually, I'm not me, I'm somebody else, and I come from that village, and blah, blah, blah. And so these people were then taken to the village where they said they were, and in almost all cases, the person that these children say they are, their life has been interrupted by an early death, often a violent one, often murder or accidents. So in that sense, there's a correlation, because this work is about very often about interruptions, unfinished business. So it seems to be that the most interesting work with reincarnation happens to be children who remember their past lives when there's unfinished business, when their lives have been interrupted. And there are lots of really interesting cases of birthmarks. So children come in with birthmarks which are in the place where they were wounded when they died and so on like that. And then in India, sometimes women mark their dead children with ashes, and then they come in with a birthmark. So there are a lot of very interesting, but that has to do with unfinished business and interruption. So there is some really extraordinary work out there. But I don't work with that, because in general, it's just too mysterious, and we can't know and don't know, and it's not necessary, because there's so much stuff around the family itself, which one can know about. Yeah. And in terms of the pained artist, whether we should remain in pain rather than heal it and stop being an artist, which I guess was an undercurrent of your question. No, I think it's much more important to resolve issues. I don't think there's a law which says we need to suffer a certain kind of thing. More healing now than
because of like world wars, all our ancestors, all our parents, we come from past society.
I think humans have always needed healing. There's no doubt that our society is completely nuts right now, but and getting nuttier by the minute. But I think humans, just by human nature, have always needed healing. Yeah, I don't think it's particular to now. Yeah.
Is there something you'd advise to do every day to help with your healing, like in a practical way to do every day?
Should we set about healing, you mean? Mm. Yeah.
Is it like a practice that you would
Yeah.
suggest?
Yeah. Yeah. Healing, holding, yeah. Yeah, because these things go on. They're racial as well. So if we want the world to be a better place, we can only do it by individually and healing ourselves. So it's very interesting. The Western world is very unique in that it has this notion of salvation history. Other traditions have circular, spiral history, recurrent eras, as in the Indian tradition of, all these different eras and so on. But Western history is this cycle of, is trajectory of salvation history. So the story begins with Abraham. Abraham is plucked out by God from his heathen background, and told to go to the promised land. And so the first thing he does is he marries his sister, Sarah. Sarah, or Sarai, as she was called then, was his half-sister. So he rejects his father, who's now considered, pagan, marries his sister and goes off, heading off to the promised land. But there's a famine, so he's diverted into Egypt. And he says to Sarah, his wife, "It's better for me if you say you're my sister." And then he sells his wife as a concubine to the Pharaoh. And then all kinds of awful famine, things start happening in Egypt. And finally the Pharaoh cottons on that this isn't the best, and he sends them on their way with lots of ill-gotten gains, with herds and flocks and slaves and so on and so on. And so he goes again, and then he comes to the kingdom of Abimelech, and he says to Sarah again, "It's better for me, if you say you're my sister," and tries to sell her again as a concubine to Abimelech, who cottons on and says, "Go away." Meanwhile, she still hasn't had a child. She's supposed to have the child who will inherit the promised land, but she's about 90 by now, so things aren't looking very promising.
Still got value as a concubine.
So she says to Abraham, her husband, "You sleep with Hagar, the Egyptian serving girl, and have a child through her," which at the time was considered how to go. So he sleeps with Hagar, has Ishmael. Well, actually, no, he sleeps with Hagar, who gets pregnant. Sarah then gets jealous and banishes them to the desert, sends pregnant Hagar out into the desert because she can't stand the sight of her. And an angel comes to Hagar and says, "Don't worry, go back. You will have a child who will be a wild and a hairy man at war with his brothers." So Hagar goes back and has Ishmael, the eldest child. And then 15 years later, when he's 15, finally Sarah gets pregnant. I don't know how old she is by then. She must be at least 100. So she has Isaac, who is the so-called promised child. So she then wants to get rid of her firstborn, Ishmael. So she says to Abraham, "Take him out into the desert." So Abraham reluctantly, it says, this is Genesis, I recommend it, it's really interesting. So Abraham takes Ishmael and Hagar out into the desert to die with a pita bread and a skin of water, and leaves them there. And a spring comes up. It's called the Samsam spring. And where he leaves them, it becomes Mecca. And and Ishmael becomes the head of the Arabs and the Muslims, and Isaac becomes the head of the Jews and Christians. And they've been at war for 4,000 years. So the usurped eldest son is exiled. So these patterns, these dystopian, these weird family patterns, are going out throughout our the line of this history, salvation history. The idea that we'll be saved at the end, which leads to the scientific theories of evolution and development and so on. So these patterns are writ large as well as individual.
What's your take on the point of it?
Sorry?
Of that separation and that remembrance and that...
I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
What's the point of it?
Of what?
The separation and the remembrance and what's actually going on?
What's the meaning of life, you mean? I wish I knew. There's no overcoming separation without separation. Oh, 9:30. Okay. So let's chant. Let's do a chant. There's one. Anyway, I hope you'll all come. By the way, I brought some CDs with me. One is overtone chanting, which is great to practice with and also as a meditation. And this is a lecture and a guided meditation, so they're both at the back, available. And leaflets of my workshops, which I hope you'll come and do. So one of the ways that the vowels and hence the harmonics have been sustained in a rather mysterious chant is in the Chant of Hallelujah, which nobody really knows the meaning of. A, E, U, I, A, no or, but otherwise all the vowels. And this is this is a medieval Irish Hallelujah chant. It's shine Hallelujah. Shine meaning to play and to sing in Gaelic. So maybe we'll end with that. So it's shine Hallelujah, 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 shine hallelujah. Okay, so thank you.